They fired me? Now I charge them $750 per hour to fix their payroll mistake. They called me redundant. They handed me a cardboard box and walked me out the door. Less than 48 hours later, their entire payroll system, the one I built, is in complete meltdown. Thousands of employees are about to not get paid. And the only number they have to call is mine. They thought my old salary was expensive? Wait until they see my new hourly consulting rate. It's $750. And the clock started the second they called. Hey, store lover. Welcome to the Narrative Hub, Reddit Stories. Believe me, this adventure gets wild, but it's only epic with you. Seriously, you make this possible. Want more stories? Greater adventure? Smash subscribe right now. Smash like. Comment below. Let's go. Let me take you back to where this all began. 3 years ago, I walked into Dataflow Solutions as their senior payroll systems analyst. The company was a mess. Their payroll was handled by a patchwork of Excel spreadsheets, outdated software, and what I can only describe as prayer and luck. Employees were getting paid late, tax withholdings were wrong, and HR was drowning in complaints. The previous guy had quit without notice, leaving behind a digital disaster that would make a horror movie director weep with joy. But I saw opportunity where others saw chaos. I spent my first 6 months not just fixing their system, but completely rebuilding it from the ground up. I created custom algorithms that could handle their complex commission structures, automated their quarterly tax filings, and integrated everything with their HR platform. I didn't just solve their problems, I transformed their entire payroll infrastructure into something that could scale with their rapid growth. The results spoke for themselves. Payroll errors dropped to virtually zero. Processing time went from 3 days to 3 hours. The company saved over $200,000 annually in overtime costs alone because employees were getting paid accurately and on time. My manager, Janet, called me the payroll wizard. The CEO, Gregory Webb, personally thanked me at the company meeting, saying I'd revolutionized their operations. I was proud of what I'd built. This wasn't just a job, it was my masterpiece. But success, I learned, breeds complacency in management. By year 2, I started noticing changes. The company had grown from 200 to over 800 employees, and with that growth came new executives who didn't understand what had been broken before I arrived. To them, payroll just worked, they had no idea of the intricate system humming beneath the surface. I began hearing whispers about cost optimization and redundancy reviews. When I tried to schedule meetings to discuss system upgrades and maintenance, I was told to hold off on unnecessary expenses. The red flags were everywhere, but like many dedicated employees, I convinced myself that my value was obvious. How could they possibly let go of the person who single-handedly prevented payroll chaos? I was about to find out how quickly loyalty turns into a line item on a spreadsheet. It was a Thursday morning in March when Janet called me into the conference room. I thought it was about the Q1 payroll review. Instead, I found her sitting across from Rebecca Martinez, the new VP of Operations, a woman who'd been with the company for exactly 6 weeks. "We're restructuring the payroll department," Rebecca said, not even looking up from her laptop. "Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately." I felt the room spin. Eliminated? But the system I built will be handled by our new automated solution, she interrupted. "We're moving to a cloud-based platform that requires less specialized knowledge." Janet looked uncomfortable, but she wasn't fighting for me. "It's nothing personal," she added weakly. "Just business. Less specialized knowledge." The words hit me like a physical blow. What about the custom integrations? The commission algorithms? The compliance protocols I built for the union contracts? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Rebecca finally looked at me. "I'm sure the new system will handle all of that. These modern platforms are quite sophisticated." I realized in that moment that she had no idea what I actually did. None of them did. They handed me the standard severance package, 2 weeks of pay, and a cardboard box. Security escorted me out like I was some kind of threat. 3 years of loyalty, innovation, and success, reduced to a 15-minute meeting and a walk of shame. But here's the thing about building complex systems. You don't just know how they work, you know exactly how they can break. As I cleaned out my desk, I tried to think of everything I should document for whoever would take over my responsibilities. But then I remembered Rebecca's dismissive confidence in their sophisticated new platform. So I didn't leave detailed instructions. I didn't create a transition document. I didn't explain the 17 critical workarounds I'd built into the system, or the monthly maintenance routines that kept everything running smoothly. If they thought I was redundant, they could figure it out themselves. But there was one thing they definitely couldn't figure out, something I'd built into the system that only I knew about. See, about 18 months ago, I discovered a critical flaw in how the payroll system calculated overtime for employees who worked across multiple departments. It was a complex edge case that only affected about 40 employees, but it could create massive compliance issues if not handled correctly. I'd built a temporary workaround, a script that ran every 2 weeks to correct these calculations before they became permanent. But here's the key. I'd always planned to implement a proper fix when I had time for a major system update. That fix never happened. And the workaround? It was scheduled to run from my personal workstation, which they'd just confiscated. I'd told Janet about this issue months ago, but like most technical explanations, it had gone in one ear and out the other. In the chaos of my termination, I certainly wasn't going to volunteer a reminder. They wanted to learn how sophisticated their new automated system was. They were about to get a very expensive education. 48 hours of silence. For 2 days after my termination, I did what anyone would do. I updated my LinkedIn, reached out to my network, and tried to process what had happened. I was hurt, angry, and honestly, a little scared about my future. But I wasn't worried about data flow. They had their sophisticated new platform after all. On Saturday morning, exactly 48 hours after they'd walked me out, my phone rang. Unknown number. Hello, this is Gregory Webb from Dataflow Solutions. I need to speak with you immediately. The CEO. Calling me personally. On a weekend. I let it go to voicemail. The message was frantic. Look, I know there's been a situation with the payroll system. Some kind of error. Rebecca said you might know something about it. Please call me back as soon as possible. I smiled for the first time in 2 days. 20 minutes later, he called again. Then Janet called. Then Rebecca, the same woman who'd told me I was redundant, left a voicemail that I could hear the panic in even through the phone. I let them all go to voicemail and went for a long walk to think about my options. The meltdown begins. By Monday morning, I had 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages. The tone had escalated from urgent to desperate to what could only be described as corporate panic. The final message, from Gregory himself, laid out the situation. The payroll for our largest client is completely wrong. Every single overtime calculation is off. We're looking at potential lawsuits, and our client is threatening to terminate their contract. This could destroy the company. Please, whatever happened between us, we need your help. I finally called him back at exactly 9 a.m. Gregory, I got your messages. What seems to be the problem? Thank God, he breathed. Look, I know the circumstances of your departure weren't ideal, but we have a crisis. The payroll system is generating incorrect overtime calculations for dozens of employees. Our new software provider says it's not their fault, and no one here can figure out what's wrong. I said, as if I was hearing this for the first time. That does sound serious. When did this start happening? Friday, right after we processed the bi-weekly payroll. Of course it did. Right on schedule. I'd be happy to take a look, I said, letting a long pause hang in the air. But I should mention that I'm now working as an independent consultant. My rates are a bit different than when I was on salary. Whatever you charge, we'll pay it. This is an emergency. My consulting rate for emergency system failures is $750 per hour, with a 4-hour minimum. And I'll need payment up front for the first day. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Did you say $750 per hour? That's correct. It's the market rate for specialized payroll system consulting, especially for emergency situations. I can email you a contract if you're interested. More silence. We'll need to discuss this internally. Of course. But Gregory, every day this isn't fixed, your exposure grows. And if word gets out that employee paychecks are wrong, I let the implication hang. I'll call you back within the hour. He called back in 20 minutes. The contract of sweet revenge. The contract I sent was a thing of beauty. Single-spaced, professional, and absolutely bulletproof. Emergency Payroll Systems Consultation Agreement. Rate: $750 per hour, minimum engagement. For hours, payment terms: 50% upfront, remainder upon completion. Scope: diagnostic and repair of payroll calculation errors. Timeline: to be determined based on system complexity. I also included my favorite clause: consultant reserves the right to refuse service or terminate engagement at any time, with payment due for all hours worked to date. They signed it without a single change. The woman who'd called me redundant personally approved a $6,000 upfront payment. Walking back into hell. Returning to data flow felt surreal. The same security guards who'd escorted me out 4 days earlier now welcomed me back as an honored guest. Rebecca personally met me at reception, her earlier confidence replaced by barely contained desperation. "Thank you so much for coming back," she said, trying to sound gracious. "I know the situation was complicated." "It's just business," I replied, echoing her words from Thursday. "Nothing personal." The IT department had been turned upside down. Whiteboards covered in diagrams, printouts scattered everywhere, and 3 very tired-looking technicians who'd clearly been working around the clock. "We've tried everything," said Mike, their senior IT specialist. "The overtime calculations are off by hundreds of dollars per employee. We can't figure out what's wrong." I sat down at my old workstation, which they'd kindly returned to exactly how I'd left it, and pulled up the system diagnostics. "Interesting," I murmured, scrolling through the error logs. "Very interesting." Rebecca hovered over my shoulder. "What is it? Can you fix it?" I turned to look at her. "Before we proceed, I want to make sure we're all clear on the scope of this engagement. You're asking me to diagnose and repair critical errors in a payroll system that processes over $2 million in wages biweekly. Is that correct?" "Yes, absolutely." "And you understand that this system has multiple integration points, custom algorithms, and compliance requirements that could take considerable time to fully analyze?" "Whatever it takes. Just fix it." I turned back to the screen and started typing. Let's see what we're dealing with. The performance. What happened next was, I'll admit, a bit of theater. I spent the first hour running diagnostics I didn't need, checking systems that were working fine, and asking questions about configurations I already knew by heart. Every few minutes, I'd frown, make a note, or mutter something about complex integration issues. The entire leadership team had gathered in the IT room, watching me work like I was performing surgery. Gregory paced behind me. Rebecca kept asking for updates. Janet wrung her hands in the corner. "This is more complicated than I initially thought," I announced after 2 hours. "The error isn't in the payroll software itself. It's in the integration layer between your HR system and the payroll calculations. Someone built a custom script that's been masking a fundamental flaw in how overtime is calculated across departments." That was all true, by the way. I just happened to be the someone who built it. Can you fix it? Gregory asked. Possibly. But it's going to require some creative solutions. This is the kind of deep system architecture work that most consultants wouldn't even attempt. You're lucky you called me. Rebecca looked pale. How long will it take? I pretended to consider the question carefully. Given the complexity and the fact that I need to reverse engineer some custom code, I'd estimate another 6 to 8 hours. Maybe more if I run into additional complications. At $750 per hour, I could see them doing the math in their heads. But the alternative, I continued, is manually calculating overtime for 800 plus employees, potential legal liability for wage violations, and probably losing your biggest client. Your call. Gregory didn't hesitate. Do whatever it takes. The fix, that took exactly as long as I wanted. The actual fix took me about 15 minutes. I simply reactivated the script that had been running from my workstation, updated the scheduling to run from the server instead, and tested it on a small batch of problematic calculations. Everything worked perfectly, just as it had for the past 18 months. But they didn't need to know that. Instead, I spent the next several hours optimizing their system. I cleaned up code that didn't need cleaning, updated documentation that was already current, and ran comprehensive tests that I knew would pass. I also took the opportunity to build in some additional safeguards, legitimate improvements that would prevent similar issues in the future. After all, I was charging them premium rates. I might as well deliver premium service. Every hour on the hour, I'd provide an update, making progress, but I've discovered another layer of complexity that needs to be addressed. At hour 6, I announced a breakthrough. I think I've identified the root cause. Give me another hour to implement a comprehensive solution. At hour 7, I ran the final test. Perfect overtime calculations, every single one. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, turning to address the room full of executives who'd been hanging on my every word, your payroll system is now functioning correctly. All overtime calculations are accurate, and I've implemented additional safeguards to prevent similar issues in the future. The relief in that room was palpable. Rebecca actually started crying. Gregory looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past week, but was finally able to breathe again. How much do we owe you? He asked. I consulted my notes. 7 hours at $750 per hour, minus the $3,000 already paid up front. The balance is $2,250. They cut me a check on the spot. As I packed up my things again, Rebecca approached me one more time. I owe you an apology, she said. I clearly didn't understand the complexity of what you did here. Would you consider coming back? We could discuss a significant salary increase. I looked around the room at all the executives who'd watched me work magic on their sophisticated automated system. Rebecca, I appreciate the offer, but I'm quite happy with consulting. It allows me to work with a variety of clients and challenges. But surely we could match whatever rate you're charging as a consultant? I smiled. To match my consulting income, you'd need to pay me about $1.5 million per year, plus benefits. Her face went white. That's more than the CEO makes. Market rates can be surprising, I said, echoing her words from our first meeting. These modern platforms are quite sophisticated, but they still need people who understand how they really work. The unexpected sequel. I thought that was the end of the story. 1 week, $5,250 earned, point made, revenge achieved. Perfect. But 2 weeks later, my phone rang again. This is Jennifer Walsh from Meridian Corporation. We heard about the incredible work you did at Dataflow Solutions. We're having some issues with our payroll system, and we were wondering if you might be available for a consultation. Meridian Corporation, Dataflow's biggest competitor. I'd be happy to discuss your needs, I said. My rate for payroll system consulting is $750 per hour. That's fine. When can you start? Over the next month, I consulted for 4 different companies, all dealing with variations of the same complex payroll challenges. Word was spreading through the industry about the consultant who could solve impossible payroll problems. My average monthly income tripled. But the real surprise came 6 weeks after my original return to Dataflow. Gregory called again. "We've got a situation," he said, and I could hear the familiar tone of panic creeping back into his voice. "The quarterly tax filings are showing discrepancies, and our accountants can't figure out why. The IRS is asking questions." "That does sound serious," I said. "When do you need this resolved?" "Yesterday. Can you help us out again?" "Of course. Same rate as before, $7.50 per hour. And given that this involves federal tax compliance, I'd recommend planning for at least a full day's engagement." Another $6,000 contract. And this time, they didn't even ask questions about the rate. Here's what I learned from this whole experience. They didn't fire me because I wasn't valuable. They fired me because they didn't understand my value. To Rebecca and the new management team, I was just an expensive line item on a spreadsheet. They saw a salary and benefits package and thought, "We can replace this with software." But what they couldn't see and couldn't replicate was the 3 years of institutional knowledge, the custom solutions I'd built for their specific needs, and the deep understanding of how all their systems worked together. When you fire the person who built your infrastructure, you don't just lose an employee. You lose the living documentation of how everything works. They learned that lesson at $750 per hour. The story of my Dataflow turnaround spread quickly through professional networks. Within 3 months, I had more consulting requests than I could handle. Companies across the industry started reaching out, either to fix existing problems or to prevent the kind of crisis that Dataflow experienced. I raised my rates to $900 per hour and still had a waiting list. But the most satisfying call came from an unexpected source, Sarah Kim, a former colleague who'd been laid off from another company the same week I was fired from Dataflow. "I heard about what you did," she said. "I've been thinking about starting my own consulting practice. Do you have any advice?" That conversation led to something bigger than I'd ever imagined. Sarah and I started an informal network of specialized consultants, all people who'd been downsized or made redundant by companies that didn't understand their value. We had database architects, systems administrators, compliance specialists, and integration experts. The irony was delicious. The same companies that had laid us off to reduce costs were now paying premium rates to hire us back as consultants. We called ourselves the Redundants, and within 6 months, we were booking $50,000 plus per month in consulting fees across the network. The best part? We started getting referrals from the very executives who'd approved our terminations. Rebecca Martinez personally recommended me to 2 other companies. The woman who'd called me redundant was now my best source of new business. A year after that first emergency call, I ran into Janet at a coffee shop near Dataflow's office. "How are things at the company?" I asked. She laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Well, we've called you back 4 more times since that first crisis. The board is starting to ask questions about why we're spending so much on emergency consulting for systems that are supposed to be automated." And what does Rebecca tell them? That's the thing, Rebecca's not with the company anymore. Turns out, firing your entire institutional knowledge and then having to hire it back at 4 times the cost isn't considered a successful cost-saving initiative. I almost felt bad for Rebecca. Almost. "The new VP wants to hire you full-time," Janet continued. "He keeps asking if there's a salary that would bring you back." I thought about it for a moment. You know what? Tell him I'm flattered, but I'm quite happy being redundant. Let me break down the math for you, because I think it perfectly illustrates the real cost of not valuing expertise. My original salary at Dataflow, $85,000 per year. My severance, $3,269, 2 weeks. My consulting income from Dataflow in year 1, $47,250, 63 hours total. My total consulting income in year 1, $312,000. Dataflow's cost to replace me, $47,250 in consulting fees, plus approximately $60,000 for their automated solution, plus the cost of the employee time spent on crises I could have prevented. They tried to save $85,000 by firing me. Instead, they spent over $100,000 just getting back to where they started, and they still don't have the institutional knowledge that walked out the door with me. But here's the thing, this story isn't really about revenge, even though that's how it started. It's about recognizing your own value and refusing to let others define your worth. For 3 years, I let a company determine what my expertise was worth. I accepted their salary, their limitations on my professional growth, and their lack of investment in the systems I built. Getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to my career. It forced me to put a real price on my knowledge and skills. It made me realize that the work I could do in a few hours was worth thousands of dollars to companies in crisis. Most importantly, it taught me that redundant is just another word for too valuable to keep. The current state. Today, 18 months after that first emergency call, I'm running a successful consulting practice with a 6-month waiting list. I work with companies across 3 different industries, solving the kinds of complex system integration problems that most people can't even understand, let alone fix. I work about 30 hours per week and make more than I ever dreamed possible as an employee. Dataflow is still a client. They call me about once a quarter when something goes wrong with their sophisticated automated system. I've stopped being surprised by these calls and started building them into my revenue projections. Last month, Gregory offered to make me Chief Technology Officer at a $200,000 salary plus equity. I politely declined. At my current consulting rates, that would be a 60% pay cut. If you're reading this and you've ever been told you're redundant, not essential, or too expensive, I want you to understand something. Those people don't know what they're talking about. Companies make bad decisions all the time. They fire valuable people to hit quarterly numbers, then spend twice as much fixing the problems that creates. The key is recognizing that their lack of understanding doesn't diminish your worth, it creates an opportunity to prove it. Don't let anyone else set the price of your expertise. Don't accept being undervalued because it's comfortable or familiar. Sometimes getting fired isn't the end of your career. Sometimes it's the beginning of getting paid what you're actually worth. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply sending an invoice.